Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Leaders Cafe by TransforMe. Many of you joining in are regulars at the Leaders Cafe, and thank you so much for your viewership and continuing to be here. We started this initiative about a year and a half back, the Leaders Cafe, with a very clear intent of bringing in conversations that matter with people who've got an opinion, a point of view on these conversations, things that are relevant, and we've done about 18, 20 of those over the last year and a half. And for those of you who are joining in for the first time, just a little bit background around who we are and why we are doing this. So TransforMe Learning, we are a leadership training and coaching company, and super pumped because this year we won two awards. Brandon Hall and the AITD, we are the finalists. Fingers crossed, let's see what happens there. And we've been around doing this work for a lot of our clients, helping them across four specific areas: leadership, team transformation, inclusion, and influence. And, you know, the last one, influence and the art of storytelling, is a great segue to why I am so excited today. Um, and the reason I'm excited today is because, one, we're going to be talking about something that is a deep passion area for me: storytelling, vulnerability, authenticity. Because all of the work that we've been doing, and for those of you who know the genesis of Transform Me and why we started, it was really a lot of our stories around vulnerability and authenticity. And today we have somebody who is the expert when it comes to vulnerability and leadership. And the more I read about him, the more I saw his videos, the more I resonated with his points of view, and the more excited I became about this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to picking up a lot of tips from this amazing expert that we have today. So it's my privilege to have with us Jacob Morgan, all the way from LA, right in the evening for Jacob. And Jacob, of course, is an international best-selling author of five books. His latest book, Leading with Vulnerability, is coming out on the 3rd of October. So be on the lookout of that. And Jacob is somebody who's, I love how he called out three pillars of his work, which is leadership, future of work, and employee experience. And obviously, he's been cited in several publications. I was speaking to Jacob backstage, and I was feeling a little embarrassed about the stuff that I put on the screen here because it doesn't do justice to all that you've been doing and the value you've been creating, Jacob. So, on that note, welcome, Jacob, and thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So Jacob, you know what? I've been stalking you a bit over the last couple of days. I've been wanting to, get a sense of what makes this man tick. What's his journey? Why does he talk about leadership, future of work, and employee experience? And I came across some very exciting nuggets, and I don't want to bring them up, but maybe to start off with, because today we are talking about crafting powerful stories with vulnerability, right? And I'd love to understand your story first of all, as we get started. What led you to the place you're in, focusing on these three areas?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. So I have the family story and then the personal story for me. The connection to vulnerability comes from my family, which grew up in the former USSR in the Republic of Georgia. And they fled the Republic of Georgia in the late 70s, early 80s. They went to Italy, which is actually where my parents met. Then they migrated from there to Australia, which is where I was born in Melbourne. And then ultimately they ended up in the United States. And so growing up in that kind of a household, although my mom always tried to model emotional vulnerability and emotion, being emotionally open, I grew up watching and emulating my dad, who believed in never getting a trophy for second place, not talking about mistakes or failures or sharing emotions of any kind. So I grew up not being vulnerable, not believing in vulnerability, and not practicing vulnerability of any kind. And I can share a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion and how that relates to the book. But as far as how I got personally involved in just going off on my own and speaking and writing and doing all this stuff, it's really because I had bad jobs working for other people. So one of my early jobs was here actually in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles, working for a technology company. And I remember that when I interviewed for this company, I was promised that I would be doing all this amazing work and traveling across the country and meeting with executives and entrepreneurs. And unfortunately, none of that ended up happening. After I took the job, I was stuck doing cold calling and data entry and PowerPoint presentations. And the pivotal moment for me came when the CEO came out of his beautiful corner office. He told me he had something very important that he needed me to do. And when I ran over to find out what that important thing was, he told me it was to go get him a cup of coffee from Starbucks. And that was around 15 years ago. That was one of the last full time jobs I ever had working for anybody else. And that set me off on my current career path and trajectory to really focus on how do we create organizations where we have engaged employees? How do we create future ready organizations? And how do we create organizations where we actually have great leaders at the helm?
Now, thanks for sharing that, Jacob. And I was really hoping that coffee story came up because I was reading up on how, your blog post on how a cup of coffee changed your life, and I was really hoping that you bring that up. And I think that's so empowering. Um, as we talk about using storytelling and vulnerability, because obviously storytelling, vulnerability kind of go hand in hand. And you've spoken a lot, Jacob, about how the world has changed and the importance of us for us to let go of the old ways of leading and embrace the new ways which are required in today's space. And with that as the context, Jacob, love to hear your views on vulnerability and leadership and what's changing. And I know you have this distinct difference that you talk about in being vulnerable and being a vulnerable leader. I love that example about the Continental Airlines CEO that you speak
Yes.
about. So can you talk to us a little bit about your perspective on vulnerability and leadership?
Yeah, a lot of people assume that being vulnerable and leading with vulnerability is the same thing, but it's actually very different. So you alluded to the story from the former CEO of Continental Airlines, so I can share that one. And that is the story of Hollis Harris. He was the former CEO of Continental Airlines, which was a struggling airline company. And in the early 90s, Hollis Harris was asked to send a memo to his entire workforce, which he did. And in the memo, he talked about the challenges that the company was going through. He talked about the fact that he wasn't sure what path he should take to help the company get out of its current struggles that it was faced. And he ended his memo by telling his employees that the best thing that they could do is to pray for the future of the company. Now, again, very vulnerable thing to do, but not a good thing to do, especially if you're a leader. So the following day, he was actually fired. And we have to remember that if Hollis were a junior employee in accounting or in marketing, and he showed up to work and he was worried about the future of the business, a lot of people would probably just say, take some time off, relax, don't worry about it. They wouldn't have had the fear and panic that they would have otherwise had if it's obviously the CEO or a top executive at the organization. So again, what he did was very vulnerable, but there was no leadership. And you can contrast this to a story that I also have in the book from Fleetwood Grobler. He is the CEO of a company called Sasol, which is a South African energy company. And when he took over as CEO, the company was $13 billion in debt. He too was asked to give a statement to his entire workforce, to do a town hall. And he did do a town hall, and he started off his town hall very similarly to the way Hollis did his. First, he was vulnerable. He talked about the challenges that the business was facing. He gave people a very realistic approach of what was going on in the environment, both geopolitically, from macroeconomics, and also what's going on in the business. He also alluded to the fact that he wasn't sure what path the organization should take going forward. But then he added the leadership piece. And the leadership piece was he communicated that he had a vision of where he believed the business could go. He communicated the fact that he believed that he and everybody in that company could rebuild trust in the eyes of their employees and the eyes of their customers. He communicated that he knew that they had a very talented and capable team. And he basically said that if you can work with me and help me achieve this vision, help me figure out the steps that we need to take to get to this vision that I have in my head, then I'm sure we can turn around the business and become successful. And that's ultimately what happened. They were able to turn the business around and become successful. So similar to the story of Hollis Harris, Fleetwood was vulnerable, but he added leadership. So a very practical, simple example that people could think of is when you make a mistake, right? We always talk about we want to create an organization where we feel like employees can show up to work each day and talk about their mistakes and failures. Well, that's great up to a point, but you have to remember that if you keep showing up to work every day talking about your mistakes and failures and challenges and struggles and feelings, At a certain point, the people who hire you are going to say, wait a minute, it looks like you're struggling in this role and maybe you don't belong here. So, a simple example, let's say you're given a project and you mess up that project. Maybe it's a client deliverable, maybe it's a presentation, whatever it is, but you mess it up. Being vulnerable would be where you go to your boss and you say, you know what, I am so sorry. I know you gave me this project, but I screwed it up. And I'm really sorry that happened. That's vulnerable, but your leader is going to look at you and say, I don't really care. Like you had a job to do and you didn't do it. Your I'm sorry is not really going to help me much here. Leading with vulnerability would be taking that same situation and saying, hey, you know what? I'm really sorry. I screwed up. I messed up this project. But here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that that mistake never, ever happens again. That's the leadership piece. So I like to think of this as the vulnerable leader equation. Vulnerability plus leadership equals leading with vulnerability. Oftentimes, we only focus on vulnerability and we forget to bring in that leadership piece to the equation.
That is just so beautifully said, Jacob. In fact, the bit that I loved was the last bit, the example that you gave about that employee who messed up something, and uh, just being vulnerable is, very different from showcasing vulnerable leadership. Um, and I know so many people that we have conversations with when we work with our clients where we're talking about what vulnerability is, and it's really this balance around empathy, connecting with people, and also being able to talk about leadership aspects of it. And I think that's really really powerful. Love it. And as you shared those two CEO stories, I couldn't help but um, think about another story that I really love, and I don't know, I'm sure you've read of it. Stephen Elop, Nokia, the 2011 burning platform story. Again, a great example in my view about vulnerability and leadership. And I just love the way, Jacob, you connect the two, because uh, when you're communicating as a leader, here's what I'm getting from you, Jacob. When you're communicating as a leader in today's world, it's really important to, yes, be vulnerable, but vulnerability is um, not just about talking about what's not gone right and owning it up. That's important. That's vulnerability. It's not just about talking about failures. That's important. But after that, how do you set the direction? How do you talk about what's next? How do you still take that leadership stand? Um, I think that's just beautiful. And I think this is a good segue, Jacob, for us to kind of talk and get your views a little bit more around storytelling and vulnerability and leadership. And for those of our viewers who've recently joined in, we're in conversation with Jacob Morgan around the best-selling author of 5 international books. And today we're talking about crafting powerful stories with vulnerability. Now, what I'd love to get your view on, Jacob, we've been you know, doing this work around storytelling training and coaching for organizations for over 10 years now, right? And I still remember 10 years back, and I know you'll resonate with this, Jacob. 10 years back, it was a really tough task to talk to companies, clients, organizations about storytelling, especially in the lens of vulnerability and authenticity, because um, there was a time when it was really about stories of success that leaders would talk about, not so much stories of failure. And vulnerability has its own stigmas attached to it, unfortunately, even today. And today, having done this work, we do see a shift, and a lot of the work that we do is also about first bringing in vulnerability and helping people understand, how do you bring that in your conversations. And the question I have for you is, what role does storytelling play in vulnerable leadership? Because you're clearly an expert on vulnerable leadership. I know that you've interviewed and coached hundreds of CEOs and interviewed thousands of employees to get research, get data around some of these aspects. So you have that. It's not just you're not just talking about this stuff just as a point of view that you have. It's really based off real lived experience that you have. So what role does storytelling play in vulnerable leadership, Jacob?
Well, I think it's a pretty big part because part of being vulnerable is to connect with people. And one of the ways that you connect with people is through telling stories, whether it's talking about your personal life or lessons learned or things that you are struggling with and trying to overcome. Storytelling is a big part of it, how you communicate it, how it comes across. So I would say that it's an important aspect of leading with vulnerability. There are several attributes that I talk about in the book that are, personal attributes or traits that people need to have. as far as how to lead with vulnerability. But storytelling, I think, is an important, maybe connecting. You can think of it like connecting tissue, right? Because it's ultimately your story that you're telling, and that's where a lot of the vulnerability and the connection comes from. So I would say it's an important aspect.
No, absolutely. And you know, because at the end of the day, vulnerable leadership is about connecting and communicating and expressing. There's so much more authenticity and vulnerability that we need to bring in. And how do we learn to tell those stories? How do we learn to communicate, share a message? Um, but even today, um, Jacob, there's still this bit of, I wouldn't call it a stigma, but a bit of this challenge around being vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's still something that many leaders are not. It's not something that people get excited about, right?
No.
Because you don't want to show your bad side. You don't want to look uncomfortable and so on and so forth. So, uh, and I'm sure you've got some research and some great experiences with some CEOs that you may have coached around. Uh, what are some misconceptions around being vulnerable that leaders have when you worked with them, and how have you shifted that for them, and what difference have they seen? So I know it's kind of three questions rolled up in one, but really wanting to get a sense of, uh, leaders have these fears and misconceptions about being vulnerable. What are those, and what does your research tell you about how people can really be more powerful by being vulnerable?
Well, the first misconception is that whenever you're going to be vulnerable, it will be used against you. Um, that's partially true in the sense that it will happen at some point, but it's not going to happen nearly as often as you think. And so, from all the research that's been done on trust games and trustworthiness, the findings seem to be that on average, the likelihood that you're going to trust somebody else is 50-50. It's pretty much the flip of a coin. And so, if somebody says, "Do you trust so and so?" you might say yes, you might say no. Again, it's almost left up to chance. But the truth is that you can trust somebody around 80%, and meaning that other people are far more trustworthy than you think they are. You think that you can only trust them 50% of the time. But the research says that they're trustworthy 80% of the time. Now, it doesn't mean that you're never going to get burned. It doesn't mean that vulnerability won't be used against you. In fact, I can pretty much promise you that at some point in your life, it will be used against you. But as I mentioned, it's not going to be nearly as often as you think. But it should be expected that it will be used against you. Similarly, that if you ask for a promotion, at some point you're going to be told no. If you ask somebody out on a date, at some point you're going to be told no. If you ask for more money, at some point you're going to be told no. In other words, these aren't reasons to not do these things, right? I mean, it's just the nature of the game. It's just part of life. You will be told no. Things will be used against you. That's life. So that's kind of the first big misconception that I think we have, is that I don't want to share something because it's always going to be used against me. That's not the case. It'll happen rarely. The second thing is, when we surveyed 14,000 employees, we asked them, what's the number one reason why you are not vulnerable at work? And the number one reason is actually interesting, because the number one reason has the solution in it. And the number one reason was, I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. That's the number one reason why people are not vulnerable at work. And I mentioned that the answer, or that the response, is actually the solution. And so, how do you help make sure that people don't view you as being incompetent when you're vulnerable? Well, you demonstrate your competence. This is where leadership plus vulnerability comes into play. In other words, don't just say, I made a mistake. Say, I made a mistake. Here's what I learned. Don't just say, I need help. Say, I need help, but here's what I'm going to do in the future to make sure that I can solve this problem on my own. Again, if you're only going to be vulnerable, then yeah, you will get that perception that you are incompetent. But if you demonstrate the leadership with your vulnerability, then that is ultimately the solution, because people won't view you as being incompetent all the time, because you're demonstrating that you're trying to close the gap. You're demonstrating that you're trying to get better, that you're trying to learn and grow, and become more competent at the role that you're in.
Yeah, no, love that, Jacob. Especially uh, the bit that you spoke about really sits well with me around, when being vulnerable, is it not going to be taken against you? It might, right? But that's not good enough reason for you to not be vulnerable as a leader. And you're so right, because when we work with leaders, one of the things that I often find myself telling them about vulnerability and storytelling, because it's also around how do you connect with people, right? And how do you build those deeper relationships, right? Um, because so often we're now having conversations that are so transactional, right? The entire world has become so much more transactional in conversations between leaders and their team members. And I'm sure there's a lens of employee experience there, Jacob, that you speak about as well. There's so much transactional relationships that are happening that there's definitely a need for leaders to shift from that transactional to really more authentic relationships. And to my mind, storytelling plays a big role in how, as leaders, we connect with our people, but also to the point that you said about relationships and trust. And yeah, like you said, Jacob, my view on trust is today in the entire world with tech organizations and with agile and all of that, there's so much talk around fail fast, right? Everybody's spoken about fail fast, right? And that's so powerful. Yeah, fail fast, get it done. And to my mind, why aren't we talking about failing fast in relationships as well, right?
Yep.
Why aren't we talking about why don't you trust people? Why don't you start with a level of trust? Why don't you start with vulnerability? Share and fail fast so you know which relationships are working, which are not, or what's working and what's not. So, what is your view on that, Jacob? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's not just failing fast, it's also what you learn from the failure, right? I mean, you could fail
Yeah,
fast and then never do something again, and that really wouldn't be beneficial. I think the probably taking it one step further would be fail fast and take stock of what you've learned. And so I've heard lots of stories from some of the CEOs that I interviewed where they were vulnerable, they had it used against them, and then they had a choice. They can either decide I'm never going to be vulnerable again, or they take a step back and they say, well, what did I learn about myself and the situation and the other person? I failed and made a mistake, but how can I move forward with the lessons that I have learned? So simply failing fast, I'd say is maybe part of it, but you also want to take a step back and look at what you learned and how you can apply what you learned into future interactions and future relationships that you have with other people.
I love it. And then that kind of goes back to the same thing. It's not just about being vulnerable, it's about vulnerable leadership. So it's not just failing fast, it's about failing fast and then figuring out what's not worked and kind of taking action towards that. Love it, love it, love it. And now I'm a little curious, Jacob, because you've obviously interviewed and coached so many CEOs and leaders. And to your mind, of the leaders and CEOs that you've coached or interviewed or spoken with, do you see a common pattern between being a vulnerable, powerful leader and using storytelling? Have you seen that with some of the leaders and CEOs that you've worked with? That are they often people who have pushed themselves to use storytelling as an advantage, as a tool to reach out, to connect, to be vulnerable, and show leadership?
Well, part of speaking is storytelling, right? I mean, anytime you share anything about you, anytime you are vulnerable in any way, you are doing so as part of a story. And so you want to obviously control the narrative of your story. And so being able to master that skill of storytelling, I think, is important. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the interviews that I've done with various leaders mention storytelling and talking about things in the right way and being able to connect with others. And I mean, it would be impossible to do that without storytelling, right? The way that the things that you say come across, the way that you structure the things that you say, I think are all important elements for leading with vulnerability.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thanks, Jacob. And that just came up to me as I was talking to you. I was like, all right, I'm speaking to somebody who's obviously coached and spoken to so many CEOs. Let's see if there's a connection that you've been able to get. And um, I know one of the books that you've also authored. So I know that your latest book, Leading with Vulnerability, is out on 3rd of October. So we're going to put it down. So for all the viewers, we're putting down in the comments a link to that book if you want to pre-order that. Uh, I also know, Jacob, that one of your earlier books was around employee experience advantage, right? Employee experience advantage. And that's one of the pillars that you feel quite passionate about. And I guess going back to that coffee cup example, I reckon that's where a bit of it comes from on how to create a positive employee experience. But, um, we saw that there was a recent Gallup survey that spoke about how employee disengagement, Jacob, is costing the Australian economy about $211 billion per year. Right? That's a lot of money, just employee
Yeah.
disengagement causing that. And, it found that one of the most significant drivers of this low engagement was the quality of engagement, not just whether you're doing it or not, but really the quality of engagement. So, to your mind, how do you feel leading with vulnerability uh, good impact employee engagement and motivation within the organization. And if you have any examples or stories to share of companies or clients that you've worked with that have been able to make that shift, that'll be really really amazing to hear.
Well, I think it does impact employee engagement quite a bit because if you think about what leading with vulnerability does, is it creates connection and it also demonstrates that you're good at your job. And so if you don't have those two elements, it's going to be very hard for other people to be engaged in their jobs. And so several of the CEOs that I interviewed, one of them, Julie Golden, I think she's the executive chairman of a company called CGI, a very large organization. And she was telling me anecdotally that their focus on leading with vulnerability, she anecdotally is able to see that employees are more engaged in the work that they're doing. Because when you lead with vulnerability, what happens is you create trust. You are able to unlock the potential of those around you. You allow other people to show up to work each day and bring their whole selves. You allow people to speak up. You allow people to share both their passions, but also their fears, their aspirations, and their hopes. And so I think it's a big element of being engaged at work. I mean, nobody wants to work for a robot. So if you want to work for a human being and be a human being, the way that you do that is to lead with vulnerability. And I think it's a huge correlating factor between that and an employee experience and employee engagement. It's something that I even found in what I wrote 2 books ago, The Employee Experience Advantage, where culture was a huge aspect of creating the overall experience for your people. And one of the top attributes of culture comes down to leadership. So I think it's across the board. It's very clear to make that connection.
Beautiful. And I just wanted to kind of take a couple of steps back, Jacob, because I was just reflecting on some of the things that you spoke about when a little while back we were talking about trust and relationship, and that kind of obviously has an overlay on employee experience, right? And I saw this video of yours, which I connected with, which was around don't show emotions, right? I think that's what you titled it. And the point you were making is that we've got to start showing emotions at the workplace, but we need to know how, right? Um, and in a lot of work that we do around storytelling, going back to what I said, the transactional communication needs to change to more authentic. And what I mean by that is we call it the neck up conversations and the neck down conversations, right? And that's where you're alluding to as well. And how can leaders start having more neck down conversations? And the connecting thread to that is stories of failure and stories of success. And in the last 10 years that I've been doing this work, I've often found that leaders, when they in the right context, leaders when they share stories of failure with leadership, now I have that angle, now I have the lesson that I've learned from you. It's not just a story of failure but with some steps, versus stories of success. Stories of failure can have a much deeper impact in creating that credibility, trust, relationship, employee experience, all of the things that we've spoken about. As long as you're not just talking about failure, you're talking about the steps after. um, what do you think about stories of success versus stories of failure from a leader perspective, Jacob?
Well, you need both. I mean, obviously, if you only have stories of failure, people are going to wonder about your levels of competence if you've never succeeded at anything, right? I mean, if I'm the coach of a sports team and I keep telling everybody about all the games that I lost, at some point somebody's going to say, well, have you won any games? So
Yeah,
similarly, you want to balance that out, right? You don't just want to have only stories of failure. But similarly, if you're only going to be talking about stories of success, somebody might look at you and say, well, that's kind of arrogant. I'm sure you've made a mistake at some point. So you need to balance the stories of failure and the stories of success. I think there's something that we can all learn from both of them. We've all experienced both of them, so there's no point in just focusing on one or the other. I think both are very important to focus on.
yeah. And I guess the real challenge is getting, because where I was coming from is that for leaders to naturally tell stories of success is so much easier because I'm really showing myself in a good light and I'm talking about something positive, and that comes so naturally and that comes easier. But to your point, if I'm just doing that, then I might be coming across as being arrogant, or I may
Yep.
not even be connecting to the truth of what I want to communicate. So love that. Got to find that balance. And for the viewers out there, please start popping in your questions in the chat window. If you have any questions to ask of Jacob, please put them in towards the end. We're going to take a few minutes to pick a few questions and get Jacob's perspectives on those. And so We're kind of getting towards the end of this Leaders Cafe, Jacob, and I've just got a few other questions which I'm sure are on the minds of our audience, because we've been running this for about a year and a half. And one of the things that keeps coming as feedback for us from our viewer, for our community, is that, at the end, can we get some quick tips? At the end, can we get some short tips, some quick things that we can start implementing when we get experts like yourself in? So, um, a lot of our viewers today are leaders in different realms of an organization. So, for leaders watching this, what would be your top three messages, top three tips? What would those three things be that you'd like to share with them?
Well, first is to practice the vulnerable leader equation. So, in everything that you do, try to bring together both vulnerability and leadership when appropriate. Or maybe another way to think about it is in any situation or interaction when you know vulnerability is going to be present, try to ask yourself, where can you also sprinkle in leadership so that it's present as well? Number two, one of the frameworks in the book I talk about is this concept of a vulnerability mountain, which basically means try to identify what's the scariest thing that you could do that's the top of the mountain, and what's something that you could easily do today or tomorrow that's the base of the mountain. And then you
Mm.
take steps each day, each week, each month to go from base camp to the peak. And you gradually take steps to improve and to get better and to experiment and see how things go. And probably the last piece of advice would be it's part of another framework that I have, but I only need to talk about one part of it. And that's this tool I created called the vulnerability wheel. And what sits at the center of the vulnerability wheel is something called, well, we all know, intention, meaning don't share or do anything unless you know why you're doing it. So don't be vulnerable unless you have intention behind it. Otherwise, it treats the engagement and the interaction like a big therapy session, and inside of a workplace setting, that's usually not the best or the most appropriate thing to do. So ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I sharing this? And if you have that intention, then you can kind of go on to the next step. So those are probably the first three things that I would start from.
Love it, love it, love it. And the last one that you spoke about, the intention, just reminds me of a recent amazing experience that I had, Jacob. I had the privilege to uh, experience and attend Anthony Robbins live here in Sydney over the last couple of days, and I attended his seminar, Unleash the Power Within, and he talks about the same thing, right? Which he spoke about the intention. And what I got from that is that, drive initiates, but why sustains. So if you're really looking at, vulnerability or becoming a better storyteller, connecting with people, I think the bigger question is, what's your intention? What's your why behind that? What's your
Yeah.
identity behind that? Right?
Yep. That's absolutely critical to have.
Love it, love it, love it. I've got I've got a lot of post-its here written down from what I picked up from that chat, and now what I'm picking up from you is also going to go up on my board. So thanks so much for that. And last one, Jacob, before we pick up some questions that are coming in from the group. Um, I also know that some of our viewers are from the HR or learning and development community, Jacob, in organizations. They head, manage HR, learning and development. I know a lot of our viewers are from that space. And for those of them watching this who are keen and who get it, that they want to create a culture of vulnerable leadership, they want to create a culture of sharing, they want to create a culture of authenticity, um, but they may be trying to figure out what's the best way to go about doing it. Any advice, any tips for HR and learning leaders on how they can start building a culture of vulnerability within the organization?
Yeah, you lead by example. It starts with you, right? I mean, you can't tell other people to do it. You have to lead by example. If you do it, other people will do it as well. So if I were an HR leader, I would probably start practicing it myself. I would start having conversations with other leaders inside the team and the organization about what leading with vulnerability means and how to practice it and implement it. I would start teaching it to other people. At the very least, introduce the language to your team and your organization so that they're familiar with what it is. But by far, the best piece of advice is if you want other people to emulate the behavior, you got to start doing the behavior yourself.
Yeah, start modeling it, create that ripple, and be the first person to bring about that change. Love it,
Yep.
love it, love it. This has been really, really spectacular, Jacob. For me personally, I've made a lot of notes, and mental notes and actually physical notes as well, going up on the board for me. And now let's move on to a few questions as we get towards the last few minutes of this Leaders Cafe. We've got a few questions coming up there, Jacob, and I'm going to just pop them up on the screen for you. My team has identified a few questions that we could pick up. Got a question coming here from Sandra, talking about how can we or what can we do to get sharper on our storytelling with vulnerability skills, because she says there's a thin line between storytelling and oversharing. So how can we kind of sharpen that? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely overshare. And we all know people who overshare at work and in our personal lives. And the reason why those people overshare is because they forget to focus on the intention. Usually, when people know why they're sharing or doing something, they tend to be very clear about what it is that they're sharing and why it is that they're sharing it. And oftentimes, when you are engaging and interacting with somebody who's just talking nonstop and they're just sharing everything and talking about anything, that's somebody who has no idea why they're doing it to begin with. They're just doing it. And so the simplest answer to that question is take a step back and say, what is it that I want to share and why is it that I want to share it? Once you answer those two things, then you'll find that whatever comes out of your mouth after that or whatever you do after that is going to be much more clear, much more defined, much more targeted, and it's going to create a little bit of a self-censor so that you don't just, start blabbing about everything and anything.
Love it, love it, love it. I love how you're able to put that clarity into that question, Jacob. And if it, to Sandra, if I can also just add, and just taking a cue from what you said, Jacob, I talk about, in the storytelling work that I do, I say to this question, I say that don't be a bird, right? Because a bird sings a song because it can sing a song because it wants to sing a song. And don't be a storyteller who's telling a story just because you want to, right? Have your why clear. Know exactly why are you telling this and what's your intention behind that. And again, kind of goes back to that importance of the why, because we've all come across people who are like just talking because they want to talk, and you can see that they're talking in their head. The intention is not to connect, the intention is not to influence or inspire. It's just something that they've got going on and they want to just kind of bring it out. So
Yep.
thanks for sharing that. Now I've got a couple of more questions here. We'll maybe take one or two more. Is acknowledging also being vulnerable for a leader. Okay, let's bring this up. So you got a question from Pratap here. Pratap is saying, thank you, Gatik and Morgan. Great point on leadership and vulnerability and the importance of taking action. Question is, what are the impediments to do that? What are the impediments to, I reckon the question is around what are the impediments to being vulnerable and taking action? And is there an example that you could share?
I think the biggest impediment is usually you. I mean, unless you're a part of a culture or you work for a leader where that is not encouraged or allowed, and if you are vulnerable, it's used against you. And I mean, obviously, if you work in that kind of an environment, you should reevaluate your career choices and decide if that's the company that you want to be a part of. But assuming that you are a part of an organization where it is okay to do these things, usually the biggest impediment is you. So, as I mentioned, from the 14,000 employees that we surveyed, it is, I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. So, it's you are scared how other people will perceive you. So, it's all about you. The way that you overcome that is, again, you add leadership to whatever it is that you're doing. And the second thing is motivation. So, one of the attributes that I talked about in the book for being a vulnerable leader is motivation. And motivation is what actually gets you to do the things that you say you're going to do. So, for example, in the story I mentioned earlier, where if you make a mistake, you talk about what you learned and the three things that you're going to do next time to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again. Motivation is what actually gets you to do those three things next time so that mistake doesn't happen again. In other words, it's very easy to say things, it's much harder to do things. So the impediment to actually doing those things is almost always you. So you need to have that motivation and that drive and that desire to get better yourself, to learn, to grow, to have that kind of a growth mindset and mentality. If you don't do that, then nothing else is really going to matter.
Yeah, that's so spot on, Jacob. And it kind of goes back to what you said earlier. You're going to be vulnerable. You're going to tell stories of failure and be vulnerable and connect with people. Let's not assume that that's not going to come to bite you back. That could happen. But so that is a risk that you're taking, like you're taking a risk when you're crossing the street every day. So can you bring yourself to take that risk and go out there and do it and not become the impediment yourself? Love, love, love that, Jacob. This has been spectacular, Jacob. This has been really, really, really amazing. And I'm sure the viewers have really enjoyed listening to you and your perspectives. Once again, for the viewers, Jacob's most latest book, Leading with Vulnerability, is coming up on 3rd of October. We're putting down a link for you folks if you'd like to pre order. There are also four other books that he's authored before this. For me, this has been really spectacular, Jacob. I've picked up a few things that I'm going to start using in my workshops. I'm definitely going to coach you on those, but I also learned copy shamelessly, but give credit where it's due. So I'm going to try and do that. But thank you so much for making time. I know you're over in LA. It's late evening for you, but thank you so much for making time to come in on the Leaders Cafe.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome, brilliant. And to our viewers, thank you very much for continuing to be part of the community. We are committed to bringing up conversations that matter, bringing up relevant topics, getting experts like Jacob to come and share his perspectives. So thanks once again. We will be out with the details of the next Leaders Cafe shortly. And thank you very much. Until we meet again, have fun and happy vulnerability, happy storytelling.